When I was in my early mid-20s, prior to discovering the Ascended Master teachings, I was attending a workshop, a spiritual workshop, where a leader was holding a session that we particularly looked at what are our goals for this life. And so everyone was thinking about this. And for me at that time in my life, probably since the time I was born, an assignment like that I took very seriously. And I wanted to capture exactly what is it exactly that I want to accomplish in this life. So when it was my turn to share and write up on the board, I said my goal was total spiritual enlightenment. And the leader who was getting ready to write on the board, he turned and he said, why don't you begin with something more logical or more achievable, not so far away? Well, while I understood what he was looking for, a goal that you could set and put your steps toward and achieve it in the short term, I didn't change my goal. Total spiritual enlightenment. I stuck with that. Now, Gautama realized enlightenment, as we know, and taught extensively about it. Now, most of us have heard the story that following his enlightenment, how the Brahman saw him sitting under a tree, and he admired his peaceful presence, his alertness, his beauty and light about him. And so he asked the Buddha, are you a god? No, Brahman, I am not a god. Then an angel? No, indeed, Brahman. A spirit then? No, I am not a spirit. Then what are you? I am awake. So what does it mean to be awake, to realize enlightenment? Is it a worthy goal? Is it something we should pursue? And if so, what is the formula? Well, let's begin with some of Gautama's teachings on enlightenment. He said enlightenment exists solely because of delusion and ignorance. If they disappear, so will enlightenment. And the opposite is true also. If there is no enlightenment apart from delusion and ignorance, no delusion and ignorance apart from enlightenment. Now, he's pointing out a fact that's very easy to not think about, and that is that enlightenment and delusion and ignorance are actually in polarity. And we'll see more about this. Therefore, he says, be on guard against thinking of enlightenment as a thing to be grasped at, lest it too should become an obstruction. When the mind that was in darkness becomes enlightened, the darkness passes away. And with it passing, the thing we call enlightenment passes also. And you think, well, how can that be? Well, because your true nature is enlightenment. So once you are enlightenment, there's no polarity anymore of that ignorance and enlightenment. He says, as long as people desire enlightenment and grasp at it, it means that delusion is still with them. Therefore, those who are following the way to enlightenment must not grasp at it. And if they reach enlightenment, they must not linger in it. When people attain enlightenment in this sense, it means that everything is an enlightenment itself as it is. Therefore, people should follow the path to enlightenment until their thoughts, worldly passions, and enlightenment become identical as they are. Now, when you think about that, worldly passions and enlightenment become identical as they are. And I think this means that in the true nature of all things is light, enlightenment, oneness. He says, as has been pointed out, not all things appear and disappear. All things appear and disappear because of causes and conditions. Nothing ever exists entirely alone. Everything is in relation to everything else. Now, science has actually discovered this also. According to traditional Newtonian science and physics, the planets in the solar system are seen as totally separate, things that move around separate from each other. Whereas with quantum physics, that sees the universe as this complex, interconnected system in which all objects are fundamentally interconnected, intermingled, and interdependent. And then think of the butterfly effect. That's the idea of that the fluttering of a butterfly's wings actually impacts another part of the world, can have far-reaching effects. And it's a concept that's rooted in chaos theory, mathematics actually, and studies the behavior of dynamic systems that are highly sensitive to initial conditions. So the butterfly effect actually suggests that small changes in the initial conditions of a complex system, our world, our universe, our consciousness, can lead to significant differences in behavior over time. So those flapping of the butterfly's wings can set off a chain of events that ultimately leads to a large scale phenomenon. For instance, a hurricane or something else. Of course, the butterfly effect is not a literal statement, but rather a metaphor that just basically suggests small changes can have big consequences. And that's because of our interconnectedness and our interdependence of complex systems. So something seemingly insignificant can have profound effects on the world around us. So basically, our science is catching up to spirituality, I'd say. Now, Buddha further demonstrates the concept that nothing exists on its own when he says, wherever there's light, there's shadow. Wherever there's length, there's shortness. Wherever there's white, there's black. Just like these, as the self-nature of things cannot exist alone, they are called non-substantial. By the same reasoning, enlightenment cannot exist apart from ignorance, nor ignorance apart from enlightenment. Since things do not differ in their essential nature, there can be no duality. Repeat that. Since things do not differ in their essential nature, not necessarily as we see them manifest at times, but in the essential nature, there can be no duality. People habitually think of themselves as being connected with birth and death, but in reality, there are no such conceptions. When people are able to realize this truth, they have realized the truth of non-duality of birth and death. He says it's because people cherish the idea of an ego personality that they cling to the idea of possession. But since there's no such thing as an ego, there can be no such things as possessions. When people are able to realize this truth, they'll be able to realize the truth of non-duality. Therefore, all the words and express relations of duality, such as existence and non-existence, worldly passions and true knowledge, purity and impurity, good and evil, none of these terms of contrast in one's thinking are expressed or recognized in their true nature. When people keep from such terms and from the emotions engendered by them, they realize sunyata's universal truth. Now, sunyata is the concept of universal oneness, having no self nature, no duality. He says, just as the pure and fragrant lotus flower grows out of the mud of a swamp rather than out of the clean loam of an upland field, so from the muck of worldly passion springs the pure enlightenment of Buddhahood. Even the mistaken views of heretics and the delusions and worldly passions may be the seeds for Buddhahood. If a diver is to secure pearls, he must descend to the bottom of the sea, braving all dangers of jagged coral and vicious sharks. So man must face the perils of worldly passion if he is to secure the precious pearl of enlightenment. He must first be lost among the mountainous crags of egoism and selfishness before there will awaken in him the desire to find a path that will lead him to enlightenment. Now, Gautama also describes enlightenment as seeing things as they really are, seeing things as they really are. that all things are enlightened, meaning all things in their true nature are enlightened. And we know that to be true, as we were created in the image and likeness of God. So we know at that level of the mighty I am, that is one with the very source of God, we are perfect. And we also know that evil is not real. It is the energy veil. It is the illusion that keeps us from perceiving the true nature of all things, the way things really are. It kind of reminds me of the concept that the masters last week shared in the sermon. All of creation moves in spirals, not straight lines, moves in spirals. So you have to ask, why don't we experience our lives moving in spirals? Well, because as you move through a spiral, you go from step A to step B to C to D. You move in straight lines around the spiral. So the perception is not a spiral, but a straight line. I mean, talk about an illusion or not seeing things the way they really are. After his enlightenment, Gautama was very practical as to how he presented his teachings to the world. He taught the middle way as the path to enlightenment, which is a balance between self-indulgence and self-mortification. We should neither overindulge in pleasures or punish ourselves excessively. He taught extensively about the nature of existence and the cycle of birth and rebirth, known as samsara. So here is some of his teachings on samsara. He taught impermanence. Buddha taught that all things in existence are impermanent and subject to change. This includes physical objects, emotions, even our own bodies. We know those are not permanent. Our minds, everything is impermanent and changes. Suffering. Buddha taught that suffering is an inherent part of existence, and this suffering can take many forms, such as physical pain, emotional distress, dissatisfaction with life, whatever. We all know what suffering can be. He says no permanent self. Buddha taught that there's no permanent self or soul that exists independently of the rest of existence. Instead, our sense of self is a result of the interplay between our consciousness and the physical world around us. So what we think of as the soul, he's saying, is not like the planets in the Newtonian physics, but rather interconnected also to all things and part of this system. Now, even though Gautama taught and believed reincarnation, he did not ascribe to the concept of this individual soul embodying in all these different lifetimes, which we may tend to think. Rather, he taught a stream of consciousness. And this is very akin to what the Ascended Masters teach about a life stream. We talk about life stream. So it's a matter of changing our perspective and starting to see things the way they really are. He taught also dependent origination. Buddha taught that all things in existence arise in dependence upon other things. And of course, this includes our own existence, which is dependent upon our parents. It's dependent upon food when we live in this dimension, the environment in which we live. So we don't exist without being dependent in this dimension on other things. By understanding these fundamental truths about existence, Buddha taught that we can overcome our attachment to the material world and find peace and enlightenment. Buddha taught that our sense of self is an illusion that arises from the interplay, again, between our consciousness and the physical world around us. He believed that the self is not a fixed entity, but rather a constantly changing process that arises and ceases in each moment. Our sense of self is therefore impermanent and ultimately unsatisfactory. Now, the Ascended Masters also teach that the soul is not permanent. It is only permanent when it reunites with the I Am Presence in the ritual of the Ascension. Buddha argued that the belief in a permanent self or soul is a source of suffering, because it leads to the attachment and craving for things that are impermanent. By recognizing that there's no permanent self, with a little s, we can overcome our attachment to the material world and find freedom from suffering. Now, Gautama distilled his teachings as the pathway to enlightenment in the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Now, the Four Noble Truths are kind of like a platform, and it's kind of like accepting what is, what exists, where are we right now. The Four Noble Truth, the first noble truth is that suffering exists. We can probably all perceive that and agree with that. The second is that the cause of suffering is craving, or sometimes they say desire. The third is that it's possible to end suffering. And the fourth is the way to end suffering is to follow the Eightfold Path. Now I'm going to just go over briefly the Eightfold Path with just very brief understanding. There's much teaching and depth that you can go into this. The first one is right understanding. So that's understanding the Four Noble Truths, the nature of suffering, and understanding what is. Right intention, developing a compassionate and ethical mindset. Right speech, speaking truthfully, kindly, and helpfully. Right action, acting ethically and avoiding actions that harm others. Right livelihood, choosing a profession that is ethical and supports one's spiritual growth. Right effort, cultivating positive qualities and overcoming negative ones. Right mindfulness, being aware of one's thoughts, emotions, and surrounding in the present moment, meaning you are present, you're mindful, you are aware of what you're doing. Your mind isn't 20 miles away while you're doing something robotically. Right mindfulness. And the eighth one is right concentration, developing the ability to focus the mind through meditation. You can see, you can notice, first of all, that all of these things are stated with positive statements. It's not any negative, you shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that. Here's what you should do. And when you look at this, evaluate it further, it's the same exact path that the Ascended Masters teach now. And can you imagine if everybody did all these things, everyone in the world, we would have our golden age, we would have our nirvana. Author Houston Smith writes in his Religions of Man, nearly half a century followed during which Buddha trudged the dusty paths of India until his hair was white, step infirm, and body not but a burst drum, preaching the ego-shattering, life-redeeming elixir of his message. He founded an order of monks. He challenged the deadness of Brahmin society and accepted in return the resentment, queries, and bewilderment his words provoked. His daily routine was staggering. In addition to training monks, correcting breaches of discipline, and generally directing the affairs of the order, he maintained an interminable schedule of public preaching and private counseling, advising the perplexed, encouraging the faithful, and comforting the distressed. So we see that after enlightenment, Gautama was totally engaged in the world. He did not go off into a cave and meditate the rest of his life. At the age of 80, Gautama became seriously ill and almost died. But he revived himself because he didn't think it was right that he should die without preparing his disciples. So by sheer determination, he recovered and he instructed his cousin and close disciple, Ananda. Then for 3 more months, he traveled through several villages, stopping in the home of Kunda, the goldsmith, which is one of his very devoted followers. Now, according to tradition, Kunda unknowingly served Gautama a meal that contained poison mushrooms. Gautama became violently ill. And he was so concerned that Kunda might feel responsible for his death, the Buddha asked Ananda Tell Kunda that all the meals that I've eaten, only two stand out as special blessings. One was a meal served to me before my enlightenment, and the other was the food from Kunda, which opened the gates to my transition. Gautama passed during the full moon of May, about approximately 483 BC. So approximately 5 centuries before the birth of Christ. I'd like to conclude, there's a Zen proverb that says, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Now, there are a number of different interpretations of this proverb, and it's very helpful to contemplate and meditate to see exactly what that means for you. But we know, following Gautama's enlightenment, his final temptation for Mara was, you can't teach this. Nobody's going to understand. And Buddha said, some will understand. And he went forth to a very full life. So likewise, this proverb represents the idea that enlightenment is not an escape from the material world, but rather a way of engaging with it more fully, becoming more present, cultivating more mindfulness, more compassion, and fully participating in the physical world, just as Gautama demonstrated. So as we claim the mantle of the Ascended Master Gautama Buddha on his Ascension Day, let us claim our own awakening and our own enlightenment to the fulfillment of our own missions. Beloved Gautama, we are most grateful for your presence, for your teaching then and now, and your presence with us this very day and always. We are grateful. Amen.